Good morning. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and delighted to introduce a very important national conversation on the nuclear summit and beyond, progress or regress. I'd like to welcome some of the smartest people in Washington to this audience, but also welcome many who are watching this by other means, many of which are arrayed against the back of the room. 7 years ago, President Obama delivered a major speech in Prague, promising to fight for a world without nuclear weapons. To get the work done, he brought leaders from around the world to Washington, hosting the first nuclear security summit here in 2010. South Korea then took the baton in 2012 and the Netherlands in 2014. This week in 2016, the summit is back in Washington, D.C., and it's time for a status report. To manage the nuclear file, the United States needs to walk and chew gum, to recall a comment about former President Gerald Ford. The threats aren't one size fits all. We have to keep our eyes on great powers like Russia. We need to watch regional pariahs like Iran and North Korea. And we need to ensure that terror groups never get their hands on nuclear material, as ISIL, so we read, hoped to do in Belgium last week. The conventional wisdom today looks a lot more like it did in 2009 when President Obama launched this conversation. Many believe the risk of a planet-destroying exchange has gone down, while the threat of a single attack by Kim Jong-un, Al-Qaeda, or others has gone up. But I don't think we can rule out a major conflict. What keeps me up at night is the risk of miscalculation, the accidental clash between the U.S. and Russia, perhaps over Syria, or Pakistan and India, that escalates and that leads to places neither party intended. Many regions, we all know this, are ready to blow. The use of a radiological weapon of any kind in Syria could become an international crisis overnight. And if the world's responsible nations, the grown-ups in the Situation Room, can't manage these risks, then that's the ballgame. As usual, the Wilson Center is ahead of this problem. Non-proliferation is one of our so-called lanes of excellence, and today's conversation is led by our top expert on the issue, Robert Litvak. Rob Litvak is our Vice President for Scholars. He handled this file on Bill Clinton's National Security Council, and he's the author of Iran's Nuclear Chess, one of the go-to monographs on this subject. Today, he moderates a conversation with brilliant thinkers and very good friends. I want to thank a special friend, Ambassador Bob Gallucci, call out the Honorable Frank Miller, with whom I serve on the Defense Policy Board, and then embarrass Assistant Secretary of State Frank Rose for joining us. Frank, back in the old days, was a member of the staff of the House Intelligence Committee, where I served for 8 years. He was a card-carrying member of Team Harmon, and we have the saying that you can join Team Harmon anytime you want, but you can never leave. So he may think he works for John Kerry, but actually not so much. And he, in addition to that, used to work for Frank Miller, so go figure. But to you, Bob Gallucci, and to both Franks, we're delighted you're here. You know a lot more about this subject than most people, and I gotta say the guy who knows the most is the moderator. Please welcome Rob Litvak.
Thank you, Jane. Good morning to everyone here and to those viewing on C-SPAN and other networks. The format will be that I'll ask our distinguished panelists a set of questions covering major topics for half an hour or so, and then we'll open it up to the audience for your questions. Let's begin with an overview. It's now been almost 7 years since President Obama's landmark Prague speech. It laid out an ambitious arms control and non-proliferation agenda. But today's world looks very different than that in which the speech was delivered. How do you, in hindsight, view the objectives of the speech and its legacy? Let's start with Frank Rose.
Well, Rob, thanks so much for having me here, and it's a real pleasure to be on stage with Frank Miller, Bob Gallucci, and yourself. And thank you, Congresswoman Harman, for having me here again today. And it's kind of like the Hotel California. You can check in, but you can never leave. Overall, Rob, I think over the last 7 years, if you look at the balance sheet, we have done a lot to improve nuclear security for both the United States and our allies. For example, in 2010, we signed the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty with Russia, and I'm happy to say that despite all the challenges that we have with Russia today, implementation of the New START Treaty continues to go well. On-site inspections in both the U.S. and Russia continue. We continue to exchange notifications of the movement of our strategic forces. In the Bilateral Consultative Commission, the body created by the treaty to work through difficult implementation issues, continues to meet and continues to work through difficult implementation issues. Through the recent Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, we have cut off Iran's path to a nuclear weapon in a verifiable manner. And through the Nuclear Security Summit process, we have locked up significant amounts of nuclear material. I saw one estimate through the efforts of the Nuclear Security Summit. We have locked up or secured enough nuclear material to create 150 bombs. So on the positive side of the ledger, I think we have made good progress. However, we do have some real challenges. As Congresswoman Harman noted, the relationship with Russia is fundamentally different. In 2009, when the president took office, we had hopes of developing a strategic partnership with Russia. I think those hopes are no longer there. Additionally, Russia has been using increasingly harsh rhetoric with regards to nuclear policy, and that is very, very concerning. And third, and this is where I've been spending a lot of my time, Russia has violated the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was ratified by the U.S. Senate and Russia in the Soviet Union, in 1988. That limits the production and testing of intermediate nuclear weapons, missiles. And what we determined 2 years ago is that Russia, over the past several years, has conducted several tests of a ground-launched cruise missile that are prohibited by the treaty. Now, we have been spending a lot of time over the past several years to try to bring Russia back into compliance with the INF Treaty through diplomacy, but to date, our efforts have not been successful. However, we continue these efforts. However, we have made it clear to the Russians and to others that we will not allow Russia to gain advantage from its violation of the treaty. So overall, I think we have made good progress, but I think we have significant challenges, especially with regards to Russia and the compliance with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty.
Frank, Bob, how do you view this balance sheet 7 years after the Prague speech?
I basically would agree with Frank. I think that the signing of the New START Treaty was important, not because of the numbers, because if you actually look at the numbers and the bomber counting rule that was exhumed, the New START Treaty allows more weapons than the Bush administration's Treaty of Moscow, but because it reestablished the basis for verification. And when you do verification, you increase transparency, and that increases stability. The nuclear security summits and the focus on loose nuclear material is terribly important work. And the JCPOA, if it continues successfully into the future, has been a tremendous gain to start to defuse a very dangerous situation. Where I would fault the administration is that it was very late to recognize that, with the exception of the United Kingdom, the other nuclear weapon states did not buy into the Prague agenda. And it took several years for the administration to get its thinking around that, and there are parts of the administration that still don't understand that. Second, a failure that's in conjunction with the first point I made, to push back against Putin and the nuclear saber rattling. Third, despite Frank's very valiant efforts to push back against the INF violation, he's been undercut by some of his seniors who, at the same time that he's pushing to get the Russians back into compliance with the treaty, are saying, but really we're ready to talk about a new strategic arms treaty, thereby signaling that it may not be that important. And finally, the administration shares blame with the Congress and the Budget Control Act for failing to do anything seriously about modernizing our strategic forces for the bulk of the administration. And if you look at the fact that the strategic modernization programs have been delayed fairly significantly while the Russians and the Chinese are fielding systems, that creates a series of problems. So it's a mixed record, I think.
We'll return to the modernization issue. Bob?
Excuse me. First, thank you, Jane. Thank you, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here with my colleagues. Generally, when we think about the topic, this nuclear security topic, I think we think in three boxes if we're thinking analytically. First box is the sometimes called vertical proliferation. And that's the arms control stuff that has traditionally gone on between the United States and the Soviet Union, now the United States and Russia. Second box has been horizontal proliferation, and that is essentially the proliferation of nuclear weapons to new countries. Think North Korea, think Iran. And the third box is nuclear terrorism, which usually has not much to do with nation states. Okay, in the first box, if you accept my three boxes, in the first box, I defer to my colleagues, but I look at this and see that we had made significant progress with the last major arms control agreement. It was a good deal for us, a good deal for the Russians, a good deal for the planet, and I see the politics as overwhelming further progress in that area. By the politics, that's shorthand for Putin. So I don't know what one does at this point with respect to that. I don't think we're going to make much progress as long as the political relationship with the Russians is as it is. But that's not bad. You know, I'm teaching at Georgetown now, so maybe that's A minus, pretty good grade. The second box, the proliferation box, Iran, for me, there are many, many things wrong with the Iran deal, but there are many more things right with it. It's way better than not having a deal, and I give a solid A there, notwithstanding the fact that we legitimized enrichment in a country that should not be enriching uranium, notwithstanding the fact that we really don't have the kind of transparency we would like to have. All that's true, and those are non-trivial. But compared to where we would be without that deal, which is, I think, looking at Iran with nuclear weapons, or essentially a conflict in the Middle East, this is a lot better. And the President deserves, and the Secretary of State, great credit for that. Again, pretty high grade on that first half. The second half of the second box is North Korea. Not so good. The North Korean case has, as we say, it is not like fine wine. It doesn't get better at the passing of time. It actually has gotten worse. The North Korean case does not look like Pakistan in the sense that North Korea has tens to 100 nuclear weapons. It doesn't. It may have 8 to 12 or so nuclear weapons, but that's a significant number compared to none. And it is accumulating fissile material. It will build more weapons. It will eventually mate them with delivery systems, even delivery systems with an intercontinental range. This is not good. One may ask, are they not deterred by Americans' nuclear weapons? Yes, they should be. Problem is, we actually don't know what this young man who runs North Korea thinks, or if he thinks about nuclear deterrence, and whether we should have any confidence that he understands the limits. So I worry about the North Korean case. North Korea policy has failed. It's failed beginning in the Clinton administration. I had something to do with that. It failed through the Bush administration. It's failed in the Obama administration. Failed in the sense we have a nuclear-armed North Korea accumulating weapons, fissile material, ballistic missiles, and sort of unapologetically. The third box, the one I spend probably more of my time on, is the nuclear terrorism box. And on that, I'm something of a critic. I'll stop after making a simple point, that there are, generally speaking, two kinds of materials one uses to make a nuclear weapon. One is highly enriched uranium, the other is plutonium. The administration has focused over these summits on highly enriched uranium. It has not focused on plutonium. Plutonium is accumulating, and what's worse, may accumulate in a kind of step function way with the introduction of reprocessing plants in Northeast Asia. If that happens, then it will be a game changer in terms of, to use another metaphor, the long pole in the tent for nuclear terrorism, the ability to acquire fissile material. So I worry mostly now about that third box.
Thanks, Bob. That laydown of issues, vertical, horizontal nuclear terrorism, very useful. And the linkage, the kind of complex and subtle linkages between these levels, I think is underscored by this conventional wisdom that Jane mentioned in her opening remarks, namely that after the Cold War, he had this conventional wisdom that the risk of great power nuclear weapons exchanges had decreased substantially, but that the risk that a so-called rogue state or terrorist group might obtain and use a few weapons has increased. And let's discuss both sides of that equation. Does that conventional wisdom still hold? Frank Miller?
Well, I think first Bob's point about Kim Jong-un is an important one. We don't know. We really don't know. And we hope and assume that he understands nuclear deterrence. But that is a huge question. Unfortunately, the very rosy predictions from the Global Zero Group in 2012 that the notion of a US-Russian war was virtually unthinkable have not come to pass, and it's gone quite badly the other way. The rise of Putinism, the Khrushchev-like statements emanating from Putin and his closest circle, the dangerous military activities using strategic bombers to fly into other countries' airspace, the exercises which simulate openly using nuclear weapons against his neighbors, and the really massive modernization programs that the Russians are involved in, along with this highly touted and questionable escalate to de-escalate strategy, suggests that the Russians view nuclear weapons differently than we do. You recall this nuclear torpedo that was leaked a few months ago as a terror weapon. And again, that's not the way we think about deterrence. So one has to worry about how the Russians think about nuclear weapons, and one has to worry about Putin's propensity to use nuclear forces at short notice. The actions in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, and indeed the use of the military forces in Syria, show that he reaches for those. So I think that is a question that we'd have to deal with again.
Great. Let's get at this question. Let me turn to Frank Rose, just sort of building on what Frank Miller said, to look at the strategic nuclear piece of it, which is really the centerpiece of your portfolio at State. A year after the Prague speech, a New START treaty was concluded, cutting the number of Russian and American strategic nuclear warheads to 1,550 deployed, also reducing launchers. And since then, as Frank Miller referenced, there's been a downturn in relations with Russia as well as China. Both of these strategic competitors are engaged in vigorous modernization programs. So the question is, do these developments signal the end of great power arms control as we've thought about it?
Well, Rob, let me start by saying this, and it is this. Russia did not sign the New START treaty in 2010 because they believe in a world free of nuclear weapons. In my view, the Russians signed the New START treaty for two primary reasons. First and foremost, they needed to maintain strategic parity with the United States. Given their economic situation in around 2009, they could not afford to maintain the levels in the 2002 Moscow Treaty. And secondly, like us, and this is a point that Frank mentioned in his comments, they valued the verification and predictability. Right. So I think it's really important to note that they never kind of bought into that vision for further reductions. Furthermore, I would also argue, if you look throughout the last 25 years at Democrat and Republican administrations, we've had an overarching objective of reducing the role of nuclear weapons in our defense strategy. The exact opposite has been the case for Russia. Russia puts a lot more emphasis, and that emphasis has grown on nuclear capabilities. And you know, I was asked, why is that? And I said, and I tell people, sometimes you need to take a step back and look at Russia's overarching strategic situation. Quite frankly, it's not a great place to be in. First, they have few, if any, allies. The United States has friends and allies all over the world. Second, their conventional capabilities have gotten better, as we've seen demonstrated in Syria, but their capabilities are not on par with the United States or our allies. Third, they no longer have the strategic weight of numbers. If we look throughout history, we talked about the Russian numbers steamrolling through Europe. They're losing several 100,000 people a year in population. And one of your colleagues here, Maury Feshbach, has written quite about this demographic challenge with Russia. Fourth, and this is a big deal, I would say they don't have a modern 21st century economy. When you think about Russia, think about what they export besides oil and gas. Not much. Then on top of that, they have a very robust China on their southeastern flank. So the question comes, given that strategic situation, what do they have to maintain their security? I would argue nuclear weapons. And so again, given their strategic situation, they are of the view, I believe, and I think the record is very clear, that nuclear weapons play a key role in their deterrent strategy, a much larger role than us. So the question is, are they prepared to move forward with additional reductions? I think the jury is out. Now, one of the challenges that we will have when we talk to the Russians in the future, because I really do believe that despite all the challenges in our relationship, at some point we will come back to the table and talk about strategic stability with Russia. That doesn't necessarily mean we will move forward with another bilateral arms control treaty like the New START treaty, but I think it's in our interest, as Frank mentioned. I mean, for me, the reason why I support the New START treaty isn't as much about the actual reductions, it's the transparency, verification, and predictability. So I think we will come back. It may not be in the rest of this administration, but we will. However, one of the challenges out there is this whole issue of non-strategic nuclear weapons. If you look at the resolution of ratification to the New START treaty, for those of you who don't know what this is the legislation that the Senate uses to give its advice and consent to a treaty. It says very, very clearly that the next time the executive branch comes to the Senate asking our advice and consent on a nuclear arms reduction treaty with Russia, it needs to take into account non-strategic nuclear weapons. And quite frankly, I think to date, the Russians have expressed very little, if any, interest in the issue of non-strategic nuclear weapons transparency or non-strategic nuclear arms control. Now, in his speech in Berlin in June 2013, President Obama proposed that we, one, seek an up to 1/3 reduction in U.S. and Russian strategic nuclear arsenals, but he also may put a proposal on a table for bold reductions in non-strategic nuclear weapons. And I would say at the time, the Russian response was less than enthusiastic. So we will have to see. I do think at some point we will come back to the table with Russia on strategic stability issues. It's not likely to happen in the near future.
I think if I could just jump in, and Congresswoman Harman pointed out the politics are driving this. The Russians stand in violation not only of the INF Treaty, but of CFE, of the Presidential Nuclear Initiatives, of the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Helsinki Final Act, and the Istanbul Agreement. So So there are a wide range of treaties the Russians have decided not to participate in or to observe at this point. So there has to be some sort of political change in Moscow that says we are going to lower the tensions with the United States and with the West, and that we are going to re-enter into the agreements that we signed up to previously. And I think it's part of Frank's larger point, that at some point in the future that may happen, but whether that happens in the near future, I don't think so.
Rob, can I just come back and to follow on to what Frank had to say? I think the fundamental challenge we see right now is this. At the level of kind of strategic nuclear arms control, Russia believes that's in its interest, and because of that, it continues to implement the New START treaty. However, kind of the point that Frank made, with regards to the Euro-Atlantic security architecture, my personal view is that Russia no longer sees value in that architecture put in place at the end of the Cold War. And when we look back, starting in 2007, with their unilateral, quote, suspension of the CFE treaty, what we have seen is a broader picture. They are slowly but surely taking out the key building blocks of the Euro-Atlantic architecture put in place in the late 80s and 1990s. And if you watch the Russian media, it's very clear that there is a narrative there. And that narrative is this. In the late 80s and early 1990s, the United States took advantage of the Soviet Union and Russia. Therefore, we signed these treaties and agreements when we were weak.
Right.
Therefore, there is no need for us to continue to maintain those treaties. So again, you've got a dichotomy. Strategic nuclear arms control, they are generally in a good place. But the Euro-Atlantic security architecture, big challenge.
So in doing a balance sheet on this conventional wisdom at the end of the Cold War, one sees an increasingly assertive Russia, an increased reliance on nuclear weapons in their strategy at a time of economic stress, which is cutting into their ability to fund the initiatives that had been under the cooperative threat reduction program that had been a major leg of the bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia. And with that, I'd like to pivot to the other side of the conventional wisdom at the end of the Cold War about so-called rogue states and non-state actors, terrorist groups. This week in Washington, there's the nuclear summit. In the Prague speech, President Obama said that nuclear terrorism was the most urgent and immediate threat. And clearly, the three preceding summit meetings and this one are addressing it in tandem with other initiatives. But there seems to be a disjunction between threat and response. And I think, Bob Gallucci, you sort of telegraphed this in your opening comments, and I'd like you to develop that point a bit further.
I'd love to. Let me say something about box one first, which I am ceding to my colleagues, but maybe with a slight lack of seating. So the concept that here that we have a look at non-strategic nuclear weapons, which are typically called tactical nuclear weapons, and that we want to look at those and the Russians don't. Right, and they have a lot more than we do. Okay? And the idea that the Russians, are weaker in the conventional area, so they need to put more of their bucks down on the nuclear side. Got that too. But there's something else going on here, and it has to do with strategic non-nuclear weapons. It has to do with prompt global strike. It has to do with the incredible, unique American capability to project force anywhere on the planet, prompt global strike. And the prompt part is the part we're working on now. The global strike part's been there for a while, and that is the ability to put lethality with precision any place on the globe within 24 hours. That's pretty impressive. It may be impressive to the audience, it may be impressive to us. I can tell you it's very impressive to the Russians and the Chinese. So I'm not saying we should not be doing that, right? And I don't carry any brief for Beijing or Moscow here, but I think if you're going to talk about why do things look the way they look right now, we ought to look at what we are doing to de-emphasize nuclear weapons. We're not de-emphasizing nuclear weapons and breeding more doves. We're de-emphasizing nuclear weapons, and we're getting new missions for conventional weapons to take on, in some cases, strategic missions. And we have to be aware of the implications of that if they can't match it. The same with BMD. If we do things in ballistic missile defense and they believe they need to respond, while we may believe they don't need to respond, we have to understand their psychology about this. And that's all I'll say.
But the only thing you should say as well
Would
is
you like
that
to interrupt? 'Cause you're
yes, I do
welcome.
would actually, because is that the Chinese and the Russians are actually doing advanced testing on prompt global strike systems, and we are still producing PowerPoint.
Well, as someone said, for years, they produced SS-18s and we produced Viewgrass. I get that. So, okay, to get back to
Bob.
this, I'm going to pivot now, pivot back to.
Threat and response, disjunction between threat and response.
I couldn't really. So, there are two issues here, and they are, as you said before, Rob, related. The North Korea case, which we may worry about because of what Jane said in her opening remarks, that she worries about miscalculation. Well, yes, and you should really worry about miscalculation when you think about the leadership in North Korea, not understanding that because they have a few nuclear weapons, it does not mean that they can engage in provocations, whether they be at sea, in the DMZ, wherever, without a response from the Republic of Korea or the United States, because they can deter this response. That's an a huge misreading of what nuclear weapons are good for. From our perspective, that's a huge misreading. I don't know whether it's a misreading from their perspective. We should worry about that. There's a huge area for miscalculation. There's another problem with North Korea, of course, and that is that they will not understand that it is threatening to the United States uniquely for them to transfer nuclear technology, equipment, or material, particularly nuclear weapons relevant technology or material. So when they engage in an activity, as they did in 2007, and build a plutonium production reactor in Syria, you remember Syria, it used to be a country, and now we find this situation, one in which the North Koreans have not learned, we don't have any reason to think they have anyway, learned that this is not a good thing to do. That building a plutonium production reactor in a country in the Middle East that sponsors terrorism is uniquely dangerous to the United States of America. I don't have any reason to think, as I said, that the North Koreans understand that is not an act to be repeated. That facility does not exist thanks to the Israeli concept of nonproliferation. But in the future, we need to worry about the transfer of material, of weapons, of technology. We need to, because that could lead to the thing I care about most and worry about most, to answer one of Rob's questions, and that is the nuclear terrorism issue. When we think about nuclear terrorism, it is the thing that every president and presidential candidate will say they worry about most in answer to the question they get, what do you think, Mr. President, is the greatest threat facing the United States of America? They will say nuclear terrorism, and they should. At the same time, they will not take obvious steps as president to do something about the key factor. It is not a trick any longer, a challenge any longer, to design a nuclear weapon. Not a simple one, anyway. That's not a problem. To get the high explosives to trigger it, not so much of a problem. The big problem with nuclear weapons is getting the fissile material. This administration, not alone, but this administration and the ones before it, have made great strides in locking up highly enriched uranium and indeed blending it down. The measure, I would say to Frank, is not how much we've done that, how many tons we've locked up or blended, but how much is left, right? And there's still a lot of that left, but I would say we're in the hunt on the highly enriched uranium. On plutonium, the other material, we are not. And the reason we are not, simply put, is because it's politically difficult. Because the plutonium comes in two kinds of places. It comes in the weapons areas of states, the nuclear weapons countries, and other countries that have acquired nuclear weapons have plutonium. But it also is used in the nuclear fuel cycle of some countries, the commercial nuclear fuel cycle. And that means, when you say commercial, think large scale. Think tons of plutonium. when enough plutonium, this is classic to do it, but the amount of material it would take to utterly destroy this city would fit in this glass. Now, and I'm talking about tons of this material in circulation in countries that have plutonium fuels as part of their fuel cycle. Now, fortunately, not too many countries do. France does. Russia does to some degree. Other countries have stopped. But what is starting is the possibility that Japan, if it starts a reprocessing plant, or Koshu, next year, would have an 800-ton plant that would be producing thousands of kilograms of plutonium. And that plutonium would be cycling all around Japan, fueling reactors all over the country. What could go wrong? And when we think about China buying an 800-ton plant, very similar to the Japanese plant, from the French, we can see that happening all around China. Again, huge quantities of plutonium in circulation. We are not addressing this problem. We're not addressing it because it's, frankly, politically difficult. It's politically difficult to tell the French, you shouldn't sell this, to tell the Chinese, you shouldn't buy this, China's a nuclear weapon state, to tell the Japanese, you shouldn't start this, start up that plant. It's hard, but it should be done. And to say you're serious about the nuclear terrorism issue when there's a game changer like plutonium in the nuclear fuel cycle that we are not addressing is, to me, very misleading.
In the Prague speech, the president talked about a terrorist group stealing, buying, or building a nuclear weapon. And your last comment, Bob, pointed to, with the increased amount of fissile material, the long pole in the tent, that opens the door for non-state actor potentially, though there's a divide on what the capabilities of non-state actors to actually build a weapon are, but that there are pessimists and optimists in that debate. But just looking at the other two routes, steal or buy, which really points to leakage or transfer. With all the bandwidth we've had in this country on Iran, with reason, in the last 2 years, when one thinks about leakage and transfer, Iran's not the first country that comes to mind. What comes to mind is on transfer, North Korea, and you alluded to that problem, and leakage, we think Russia and Pakistan. You oversaw the negotiations with North Korea in the 90s that bottled up, froze activity at in their plutonium program. A critique of the Obama administration is that it has not brought the creativity and focus that it brought to the Iran case, to the North Korea case, which seems caught in this tension, policy tension between North Korea asserting we'll only come back to the nuclear table if you accept us as a nuclear weapon state, and the United States saying we'll never accept you as a nuclear weapon state, and not getting past that impasse. And on Pakistan, one sees, which many people identify as sort of the nexus of terrorism and proliferation, one sees them moving into a destabilizing area of tactical nuclear weapons. So in this last sort of round of questions before we turn to the floor, I'd like to get first Bob on the kind of Iran, North Korea, and you mentioned deterrence, the role of deterrence, like don't even think about transferring it. But is the door open at all on, is there any possibility for an arms control component to at least freeze, say, their HEU program? And Frank and the Franks, if you want to weigh in on the Pakistan piece and follow on, we can do that. Bob?
So you asked a lot of questions. I don't know if you noticed that, Rob.
It's a merged question, you're right. So pick out which piece that you wish to
I mean,
respond to.
right now, I probably would rate the Pakistan situation as the most dangerous for us. Pakistan is right now the country that is building the most nuclear weapons, the fastest, and delivery systems actually quite diverse to go with those weapons, and it has both uranium enrichment and plutonium separation for weapons. And Pakistan is Pakistan. By that I simply mean that it is a complex country. It has the most radical interpretations of Islam running loose in this country. There have been attacks on military facilities, and we should worry about this. And the Pakistani response, which is to worry more about us, sort of an Osama bin Laden raid on their nuclear facilities, than to worry about the terrorist internal threat. and that has consequences. So the Pakistan case is a uniquely difficult, painful one for the United States because we have a lot of history with Pakistan. The Iran case, I think, I would say, for a while, provided we watch very carefully, may be in cryogenic arrest. I mean, the nuclear part of that, I mean. We should be monitoring that deal. We should watch it very closely. One of the problems with the North Korea deal implementation, the agreed framework, was we really didn't afterwards watch very closely, pay much attention. We can't make that mistake in the Iran case. Your point about North Korea is well taken. The administration has been very concerned that the North Koreans are not serious about any negotiation that would involve giving up their nuclear weapons. I would not be prepared to say that. I think under some circumstances, if we can meet North Korean security needs in an overall settlement of some kind, it might be possible. It's all worthwhile trying.
Frank Miller?
I know you
Rose,
want to get to questions.
Any comment
from the
before we
audience.
go to?
You know, let me just go back quickly to a point that Bob made about Chinese and Russian concerns about American strategic capabilities. I would agree with Bob is as we think about strategic stability in the future, we need to factor in these new strategic capabilities: cyber, space, missile defense, conventional strike. While I don't think any of those capabilities fundamentally alter the nuclear equation, I think they impact it. The United States has been very transparent about its missile defense, space, conventional capabilities. Russia and China have been less so. We have made it very clear that we are prepared to have a discussion with both Russia and China on the full set of strategic capabilities. One of the issues with regards to Russia that I have been involved in for 3 administrations now is missile defense cooperation, and there have been numerous proposals for cooperation and transparency that we have put on the table, and the Russians have rejected all of those proposals. We have been trying to engage China in a dialogue on strategic capabilities, the very concerns that Bob mentioned, but there has been a clear reluctance on the Chinese behalf to talk. So bottom line, Bob, I agree with you. We need to factor these issues into our strategic discussions. However, our Russians and Chinese colleagues have been less than, I would say, enthusiastic about engaging in those types of discussions.
And I'll make 3 points very briefly. One, I worry very much about the Pakistani case. In addition to it, and taking in full account what Bob said, the fact that there are elements in the Pakistani government which believe that their nuclear deterrent allows them to carry out acts of terrorism on a large scale and be protected from that. And that's a very dangerous assumption. Second, I think that with the young leader's father, there was probably a better chance to come up with some sort of a deal. And I think with the young leader, I'm just not so sure. And third point's not that important.
Let's open it up, floor for comments and questions. First go to Jane Harmon. And we have a microphone coming to Jane. And if speakers could please identify themselves and their affiliation.
I'm Jane Harmon. Bob was giving grades to various things. I'd like to grade this panel an A+. I think everyone here not only learned a lot, but enjoyed this. So finally, Rob got around to asking the P question about Pakistan at the end. And I just want to expand that to P+I, India. I mentioned that one of the miscalculations could be this endless feud between Pakistan and India, and the fact that both of them have nukes, and the fact that at least Pakistan now, in addition to having nukes, may have small nukes, so which are just as dangerous, or could be, and certainly could create the chance of miscalculation. So what about P+I?
Well, that's what I was talking about. That really worries me because the Indian response would to yet another major terrorist attack will be some sort of conventional action, which the Pakistani army says it would meet with nuclear weapons. And while neither side may actually believe that that would happen, once the events get into play, it could be the August 14th scenario. That one truly worries me, and it's outside our control.
The Pakistanis, are emphasizing nuclear weapons to make up for conventional asymmetry
Right.
in South Asia. Bob was a former dean at the School of Foreign Affairs at Georgetown, where in
And
the
we
classes,
forgive him for that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
in the classes they distinguish between deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial, and we talk about deterrence by denial. Don't think about doing that. We also talk about deterrence by denial, which requires a modicum of cooperation. And the question in dealing with the hard cases like Pakistan is, how do you kind of modulate policy where you have a deterrent threat to focus their attention, like don't even think about doing it, but you don't sort of overshoot on the punishment side to the extent that they will not cooperate with you to do some prudent things to secure their weapons.
So there was this great professor of international affairs, Kenneth N. Waltz, who didn't like this denial deterrence and punishment deterrence. He said, stop that. There's only one kind of deterrence, it's punishment. And if you are going to deny access, that's defense. And it may work psychologically as well as in fact, but that's not deterrence. He said it's very useful, and this is a matter of definition, and it helps in answer to your question.
But he was also a structural realist who viewed the world a certain way. So.
You know too much.
Okay.
So, so the issue here is that the Pakistanis are the question is red line here. I know the red line's gotten a bad name ever since our president, from my perspective, misused it in the case of Syria. But red lines can be useful if they're drawn correctly and they're credible. And what the Pakistanis have tried to make clear is that a compromise of their sovereignty by Indian armor, for example, would be crossing a red line. And that they believe that using nuclear weapons on their soil should not bring a retaliation from the Indians. I mean, this is the scenario we all worry about. The Indians don't believe that simply crossing into Pakistani territory with conventional forces should trigger a nuclear response. It's in that kind of thinking of back and forth that we all worry about the miscalculation going on. And I don't know how one unscrews that problem except by improving relations between these two countries, which has a lot to do with having the civilian narrative in Pakistan prevail over a military narrative that the only threat the Pakistanis face comes from India, when in fact probably the only opportunity that Pakistan has comes from the Indian economy. Right. So it's very hard to fix this problem.
Other comments, questions? Let's see, we have a microphone to this gentleman in the middle. Please just identify yourself and your affiliation.
My name is Jeremy Pearson, former AAAS Congressional Fellow. Thank you very much to the panel and Wilson Center for holding this event. A question for everyone, but specifically for Ambassador Gallucci as well. As we're aware, there are many pathways to getting to making a nuclear bomb, and then another threat that hasn't received much attention, of course, is a dirty bomb. Now, my question is with regards to your comments, Bob, with recycling and reprocessing. From what I understand, when you take high burnout fuel, the isotopic ratios may not be as amenable to making an effective bomb. So I'm wondering if that is something we really should be concerned about, and maybe thoughts on where we should be putting our attention.
Yeah, let me, thank you for the question. There is it's almost conventional wisdom that the conventional wisdom goes like this. There are two types of design for a simple weapon: a gun type design, the weapon that was used on Hiroshima, and an implosion device, the design that was used on Nagasaki. The first requires highly enriched uranium and cannot be made successfully with plutonium. The second can be made with highly enriched uranium or plutonium. And, right, so you got that in your mind. The first type, the gun type, is much easier to design than the second type, the implosion type. So the first proposition that comes from this conventional wisdom is that terrorists can only do the first type. Okay? So that means terrorists can only make a weapon, a true yield weapon, not a dirty bomb, a yield weapon with highly-enriched uranium, right? That's where conventionalism. Second, with plutonium, if they do not have plutonium of a certain high percentage of plutonium-239, and instead must suffer through the handicap of designing a weapon with even isotopes, 240 and 242, then they will get enormous spontaneous neutrons emitted, and they will get pre-ignition, and oh, it'll be terrible. And therefore, since high burnup fuel has more of the even isotopes in it, the kind of fuel that would be reprocessed in Japan or in Russia or in a commercial fuel cycle, that's the only kind of stuff available. So at the end of the day, the conventional wisdom says, both for weapons design and high burnup fuel, the plutonium thing is self-limiting. It can't be used. It doesn't fit in the first design, and it won't even work in the second design. Now, the problem here is that is technical nonsense. Apart from that, it's fine. Would you like me to explain why it's technical nonsense? I can't.
Question, the side?
I want to address the second and third
Could you just
buckets
identify
of
yourself,
the
please?
ambassador. My name is Dave Freeman. I'm the former chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority, but my real claim to fame is I'm a friend of Jane's. In the second and third buckets, you mentioned the political difficulties, but isn't it time to use plain English and face up to the fact that there is no such thing as a peaceful atom, and that the nexus of our problem is that we promise people all over the world nuclear power plants, and we continue to advocate nuclear power in this country. When are we going to include in the discussion of this subject the fact that we are hoisted by our own petard when we continue to advocate the pathway to the bomb, which is an atomic power plant?
Well, there's this, dilemma that a source of scalable low-carbon energy this half of the century is going to come from the nuclear will be a piece of it. We had Secretary of Energy Moniz here on a couple of occasions talking about that.
Why can't we be offering people all over the world cooperation in solar, wind, and storage instead of nuclear power?
That's one way to go. The other's access to the full fuel cycle and reprocessing that could make it safer. Did you want to lead off on that, Frank, or Bob's raring to go?
I'm raring to go. Look, right now nuclear energy provides maybe 19% or so of our electrical generating capacity in the United States. And it's going to provide something like that for a while. My own personal view is that if we didn't have to have nuclear energy, that would be great. It is carbon-free. I have been on a different track than the one you suggest of giving up on nuclear energy and saying I want to give up on that which is clearly uneconomical. That's to say plutonium recycle, thermal recycle, current generation of reactors, that closing the back end of the fuel cycle is crazy in economic terms, wholly apart from the security terms I've been talking about here. It's crazy in economic terms. There is no such thing as a peaceful atom. I mean, you get energy, right? It depends how you organize that energy from fission, and that's what we're talking about here. So I'm with you on that, but I find it. I find it, while the argument I've made here is a difficult argument to make, I said it was politically difficult, it becomes much more difficult if I come out against nuclear energy too. I mean, I'm willing to say that you don't have certain problems if you can have energy from renewable sources. I get that, and that's fine with me. I'll go as green as we can support. But in the meantime, if we're going to have nuclear energy make up almost a quarter of our electrical energy production, and in a place like France, it's like 80% or something of their electrical generating capacity, you're not going to throw that out tomorrow morning. So in the meantime, I want to say let's enjoy, quote, enjoy nuclear energy in a way that's safest as possible and is not economically crazy. That's all. I think that's an easier argument to make. I don't have any problem with you making that argument. It's not going to be mine, though.
in this tour d'horizon of nuclear issues in a compressed period of time, there's one issue I wanted to get to, which has to do with this question of a nuclear force modernization or not in this country. And under the Stockpile Stewardship Program, the United States is refurbishing its nuclear arsenal. Critics claim that this program will make nuclear weapons more usable by decreasing their yields and increasing their precision. The administration steadfastly resists this characterization, claiming that it is maintaining existing capabilities without testing, and it's not developing new capabilities. But I want to start with Frank Rose. Give us clarify this, this issue of modernization versus refurbishing, and I know Frank Miller's got a view on this as well.
No, Rob, thanks for that question. Let's go back to 2009 with the President's Prague speech. One of the lines that people forget about is that President Obama, in that speech, made it very clear. He said, and I quote, "As long as nuclear weapons exist, the United States will maintain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent." And this is important for a couple of reasons. One, to reassure our allies around the world who don't have nuclear weapons that they don't need nuclear weapons. And secondly, to maintain strategic stability with countries like Russia and China. Now, following on the President's speech, in 2010, the administration published the Nuclear Posture Review. And in the Nuclear Posture Review, it was very clear that we will not develop new nuclear weapons. We would refurbish existing warheads like the B-61, but we would not provide them any new military capabilities. And that remains this administration's policy. And I would argue, if you look at the refurbishment program, it is fully consistent with the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review. Now, with regards to the delivery vehicles, this is the new submarine, the new bomber, as well as the new ground launch missile. Here's the challenge. Most of these platforms have been operating well past their service lives. Therefore, in order to maintain a secure and effective arsenal, we are going to need to modernize these platforms. We don't have a choice. As Admiral Haney, the commander of Strategic Command, mentioned in his speech a couple of weeks ago at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, we have run out of time. And therefore, I believe, again, that the modernization of our delivery platforms are fully consistent with the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, as well as the President's 2009 Prague speech.
We're on short time. Do you
3 points.
agree
The
with
first
that,
point
Frank,
is
or-
that people conveniently forget that the deal to get New START ratified was that the President also endorsed the modernization program. That was critical to getting sufficient votes in the Senate to ratify New START. Second point, I won't go through the laundry list of systems, but the Chinese and the Russians are putting new systems in the field right now, land-based missiles, sea-based missiles, submarines, in the field, in the water. The new U.S. submarine will not hit the first Ohio replacement submarine won't hit the water till 2028. The new bomber, late 20s. The new ICBM, late 20s. So there's a lot of catching up to do, and we are not provoking Chinese and Russian modernization. Third point, from 1985 until 2001, I directed U.S. nuclear planning, okay? I did the war plans. I interacted with 2 presidents and multiple secretaries of defense. It is a complete fiction that a senior American official would say, oh, that's a low-yield weapon, I'm going to use that. The notion of crossing the nuclear threshold is the most serious decision any president or any secretary of defense would recommend. And the notion that it's only half a kiloton or a kiloton instead of 10 kilotons does not enter into that. If the president, any president, were forced into the use of a nuclear weapon, the president would use the nuclear weapon in the arsenal that was most suited to the task. But it's a calumny to suggest that modernizing the force leads to the increased possibility of use. It's just a calumny against any president, any secretary of defense, any secretary of state.
certainly the decision to use any nuclear weapon would be strategic, and in the past, these capabilities have provided some flexibility in terms of yield options. Final question to Elizabeth Rorlick, one of our residential fellows here.
Thank you. Elizabeth Röhrlich. I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center and work on the history of the IAEA. Thank you for this very interesting panel. I have a question which relates to something that was strikingly absent, I think, from the debate, and this is the CTBT. Is that because it is not a priority at the moment? Is it because nobody believes that it will be ratified by the US soon? So what's your opinion on that? I think it's a question to the whole panel or to whoever wants to answer. Thank you.
There was a panel a few months ago that Ernie Moniz and Secretary Kerry engaged in that talked about ratifying the CTBT. And the conclusion of that was that it would take a great deal of groundwork in this country to get CTBT ratified, and that groundwork hasn't been taken. Second of all, if the U.S. ratification of CTBT would bring the treaty into effect, that would be a strong argument, I suppose, for pressing ahead. It won't. The countries that will not join the CTBT are India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea. So the CTBT is not going to come into effect. That is a basic fact. And third, the United States is obeying, has had a nuclear testing moratorium since 1990 under the Bush 41 administration. So people ought to focus on the intent of the CTBT and not the ratification process, which will not bring about entry into force.
Yeah. Let me just make a couple of points. I was actually working for Frank as his special assistant when ratification debate began. And there were fundamentally two questions that opponents of ratification raised. First, that the CTBT was not effectively verifiable, and secondly, that you could not maintain the weapons without testing. I think we have made a lot of progress since then. I think what we have seen on the verification side of the house, that through the international monitoring system, we have dramatically improved our ability to verify nuclear explosions. Furthermore, and I think the lab directors have certified this every year since the late 1990s, is that we have been able to maintain our weapons without testing. However, if you look at the U.S. Senate, I believe 80% of the senators who are now in the Senate weren't present during the ratification debate. And as Frank noted, there has not been a great deal of discussion about the benefits of the CTBT. So instead of pushing for ratification at this time, what the administration is focused on is an education process, discussing the merits of the CTBT with the public, but more importantly, the merits of the CTBT with members of the Senate, many of whom are not cited and particularly knowledgeable about the specifics of the treaty.
Thanks, Frank. Bob, we're going to give you the last word. Are you more optimistic or pessimistic at this point than you were in a decade or more ago on the nuclear front?
I am.
Thank you for that appropriate non-answer. I'd like to thank all those in attendance today, those viewing on C-SPAN and other networks. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their excellent remarks today.